Well, we're joined now by General Chip Chapman, who is a former senior British military advisor to US Central Command. General Chapman, thank you very much for joining us once again here on Arabiya English. I'd like to start by asking you what you make of President Trump's latest messages. He's calling on protesters to keep up the momentum, to take over institutions, and he says help is on the way. What do you think that means?
Well, like all these things, the sequencing is important because we had the protests from the 28th of December to the 12th of January, but the one on the 13th. And when you've got a repressive regime which is doing really nasty things to you and killing potentially tens of thousands of people, there's a difference between being locked and loaded, which the US always are for a fight tonight capability, and having a ability to do a campaign. So the first thing, of course, is that they need to make sure that the force protection is okay in the Gulf because of the threat of retaliation. And secondly, it takes a long time to get the outflow of their assets to do something. So it might be premature to protest now if you're going to be killed for the sake of doing nothing. The outflow would be a number of indicators that we look for, including, for example, tankers and bombers being sent to Diego Garcia or something like that. But that said, there are a different number of target sets which the US would be looking at, depending on what they wanted to leverage they wanted over the Iranian regime.
Right, and in terms of the timing, do you think there's a sense in the Trump administration and in Washington generally that they'd better act now while the momentum is there? Because if they let it pass, I mean, another opportunity like this might not present itself for who knows how many years.
Well, I think you should look at this as a marathon, not a sprint. So don't worry if there's not been protesting for a couple of days. I think the fundamental thing from how Trump looks at these things is, and you can see this also with Ukraine, is that the first thing he always really talks about is what one might call a humanitarian peace, stop the killing, be done. That's essentially what he first said in his town hall in May 23 there. So I think he'd like to do that. Now, the Iranian regime also always has a very low bar. It's regime survival. And they frequently drunk from the chalice of poison, both in releasing the American hostages and in 1988 in ending the Iran-Iraq war. So I think there is a possibility of drinking from a chalice of poison. I don't think there's a possibility of any grand bargain. And that might initially be stopping the executions and stopping the killings, but that's a very tactical thing. It's different than the structural problems which face the Iranian regime, and that is the problem for the future, for the regime, that you've got this growing incompatibility between its ideological and revolutionary nature needing to export the revolution, as it were, and the social demands of the population. Because I think we need to be clear that the sources of discontent when this kicked off were actually to do with the collapse of the national currency and the surge of prices and inflation. It was not to do with the US, nor was it to do with Israel, in the same way that it wasn't in 2022. Now, the Iranian regime may have changed the framing of that in the last few days, and that could play in their favor, because what lots of people don't want in Iran is chaos in the way that they saw that unfolding in Syria or Libya or Iraq. There are a number of people who want stability and security over the uncertainty of radical regime change.
Right, and I'm just wondering, in terms of reading between the lines and looking at what sort of direction things could be heading in. I mean, it was announced earlier today that direct US-Iran contacts have been suspended. So it seems like diplomacy is effectively off the table, or maybe you've got a different opinion on that. Does that suggest to us that we are a step closer to some sort of military engagement on the part of the US than we were, say, yesterday?
Yeah, I think it does. You have a triangle of pressure, reward, concessions. And so if you thought that this was a escalatory ladder and that the US have broken off diplomatic relations and talking, then you would think that they're going to go to a posture of potential military action. Of course, there may be other things that come before that in terms of OCO, offensive cyber operations, which could degrade and destroy certain elements of the IRGC's computer infrastructure, and that itself might have an impact on exacerbating the economic situation of the regime, because that could degrade the sort of links for banking and things like that. And loyalty is often built by being able to pay your troops or those that are loyal to you. If that doesn't happen, that could lead to a splintering. If again you get enough people out on the streets. Now, it's always been a metric again that if you can get 3.5% of a population on the streets to protest in a non-violent way, then a regime is in trouble. The problem with that historically, or now in the contemporary age, is that was before we had this sort of digital curtain which Iran has thrown up. And so in this age when you can cut off a kill switch, cut off all the internet, then you've got a problem. And Iran, the regime, are controlling the information space at the moment, and indeed have said that Iranian state TV have said that social media is an enemy battlefield. They control that at the moment.
Right, and in terms of how we interpret where they think they are, I mean, the Iranian foreign minister said on Monday we're in absolute control of this situation, and subsequent analysts we've spoken to have said that if you have to say that, it probably means you're not in absolute control. I mean, have you seen anything or heard anything that sounds like a crack in the facade, or something that perhaps could be exploited by the Americans?
Well, I think the regime media have been triumphalist, and that's fair to say that. There are ways you can crack this, though, by other means. So, for example, in 1988, it was an American kinetic action by a thing called Nimble Archer, which collapsed the Gulf, the gas and oil platforms of the Iranians. And you could do something that on Karg to stop the 2.2 million barrels of oil that are coming out. They'd have to calibrate that quite carefully in strategic terms, because it's always been that there have been three strategic objectives really for America and the West, and that includes keeping the sea lanes open and not having the Strait of Hormuz closed, alongside deterring regional war and preventing nuclear proliferation. It could be that part of the deal that is done is to have some sort of compliance with what was formerly the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, but it's also worth saying, of course, that it was Trump who withdrew America from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action.
Right. In terms of the US options out there, I mean, you've talked about some of them, and obviously sanctions have been in place for quite some time. Those are being tightened up in the form of secondary sanctions. There are, of course, cyber measures that can be taken. And then obviously Israel, in the last 15 months or so, has demonstrated that it's got extremely reliable intel on Iran. I mean, going right way through the ranks of the Iranian leadership and also their proxies. And I'm wondering whether you think perhaps a campaign of precision strikes might end up being the preferred course of action by the Americans.
Yeah, well, I think then you look at the target sets based on what the outcome you want from the American perspective. And I think there were three which play into this. The first one is leadership targets. It's the command and control. It's the media stations. It's high-value targets of the personnel, IRGC, and those surrounding the supreme leader. The second one is internal security targets, the slightly wider with the Basij and the Artesh, the Iranian military. And the third one would probably be the economic targets, as I mentioned, about the gas and oil platforms. You could have a bundling of that, which would be not quite leadership decapitation, but the pressure around those elements, which may lead people to defect. And it's when you get that defection of the loyalty, then that regime is generally in trouble.
Again, then, of course, Iran would be expected to respond. And looking at the most recent pattern of events, most likely they would aim at US bases in the region. And I don't know which bases you think would be most likely to be targeted, and how you think Washington would then respond to such a retaliation.
Well, I think we saw in June, of course, that the retaliation that the Iranians did then was performative rather than sort of a military significance. And that's why I said that the first thing that the Americans need to do is get their force protection in place for two particular areas, really. The first one is for their Fifth Fleet facilities in Baghdad, of which there's a US component, UK component alongside of that. The second one is the assets that they've got, largest airbase in the Middle East at Al Udeid in Qatar. Qatar and making sure that they got the air defence there. It's that which would be their first thing before, as I said, you see the outflow of their assets if they were going to do a sustained campaign against Iranian targets. It won't cut it if you just have a few Tomahawk missiles going in on a few buildings from time to time.
Okay, and if Russia, if Ukraine, excuse me, let me just do that question again. I got my countries muddled up. And if Iran then turned to its allies, I mean, could you see any of Iran's closest allies? I know the list is shrinking. Could you see any of them somehow coming to Iran's rescue here?
No, I can't. And if you look at at Russia in particular, Russia's had a bad last year. It sort of didn't help Syria, that fell. It didn't help Iran in June, and it didn't help Venezuela. And the commonality between all those three, apart from the fact it didn't help, is it showed probably the superiority of Western technology over Russian air defense systems, particularly the S-300. And I think one of the things that we saw from the 12-day war in June is that both the Americans and the Israelis have freedom of action and escalation dominance to do anything they want over the airspace of Iran.
How much influence do you think Israel's got over Washington's thinking at this precise moment?
I think that Washington always looks after its own vital interests, but I think it would also be fair to say that particularly in terms of the nuclear file, that both of them have a common objective to ensure that Iran doesn't want a nuclear weapon. But I don't think that's one of the target sets which is key, nor is it the highest one you would want to go for if you want to collapse the regime.
And just looking at this whole situation in the context of other escalations that we've seen in Iran over the years, would you say it would be fair to characterize this as the most serious threat that the leadership in Iran has faced since '79?
Yeah, I think you could say that. So, for example, we've had protests before in 1999, 2009, 2017, 18, 2022. I think this one is not going to go away because of that structural problem. And as I said, this growing incompatibility really between the ideological nature of the regime and the social demands of the population. I can't see how they close that gap in terms of both inflation and the basic human desires to eat and have food and get slightly wealthier when you've got this revolutionary nature which represses its people. The two are going to be like oil and water at some stage. I don't think it will be in the next week or 2 weeks, but this won't be over. It is that marathon. It is not a sprint.
Okay, we really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. General Chip Chapman, always a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom.
Well, we can cross now to Andrew Webber, who is former US Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear, Chemical and Biological Defense Programs under President Obama, and currently a senior fellow at the Council on Strategic Risks. He joins us from Ohio. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Mr. Webber. How likely do you think some form of US intervention in Iran is at this stage?
Well, apparently President Trump is meeting with his National Security Council today to make those decisions, and they will present him with a range of options from military force to economic sanctions.
And would you be surprised at this stage were doing nothing to be the chosen path?
Oh, I would be very surprised. President Trump seems personally horrified by the massacre of civilians that's occurring inside Iran. And I would expect some type of serious action to try to save lives of the people who are fighting for their freedom on the streets throughout the country of Iran.
Right, it was announced today that direct US-Iran contacts have been suspended. Sounds as though diplomacy is being put to one side. Does that in turn suggest a step towards some form of military intervention?
Well, I would not be surprised, given the fact that in Operation Midnight Hammer, we had a military attack against Iran together with Israel last year that was very successful, using air power, the B-2 strategic bomber. I think his success, at least in the short term in Venezuela, will make him likely to think seriously about using military options, especially air power.
And part of the calculation that's made before a decision is taken will be a look at what the options might be that Iran will choose in terms of a retaliation, and Iran does tend to retaliate. How dangerous do you think it is that there's a risk with the regime boxed into a corner of some sort of a miscalculation, given, and this is where we draw on some of your expertise from your role in government, that they are understood to have some stocks of unconventional weapons?
Yeah, well, a cornered rat is always very dangerous. They could lash out. I believe there's a lack of understanding between the two countries. Clearly, we've seen that play out over the last year over the nuclear issue. Iran does have programs especially in biological weapons that could be used in a covert attack against the United States, against the homeland even, covertly. So it is a concern about retaliation, but I will say that the Iranian regime has never been weaker. They've suffered really catastrophic losses of an ally with the Assad regime fleeing to Russia. Hezbollah defanged, and their other proxies seriously diminished. So Iran is in a very, very weak position, and obviously the focus of their security forces today is on internal control.
Right, and when you hear President Trump saying, quote, help is on the way, does it sound to you like the decision's been taken and something's going to be done, imminently?
No, I don't believe the decision has been taken. I believe he's meeting with his advisors today to review the options and most likely pick one of them. I mean, there are other things we could do short of a military attack, for example, in the cyber domain. So I think that it may come quickly, or it may be there may be a delay. We are flowing some forces to the region, but we have quite a number of forces that were involved in the Venezuela operation. So I don't think there's any time pressure to act, although as people are being gunned down on the streets by their own citizens in the security forces, there is pressure to do something quickly.
Quickly, because there's a concern that the momentum could disappear with the passage of time, or because the authorities may come down so hard on protesters that effectively puts a stop to the whole protest movement. Is that what you're getting at?
Well, the regime is tottering. I mean, the supreme leader is elderly, weak, and the government, the president has sided with the security forces, so he's lost his legitimacy. I think this might not be the end of the theocratic regime in Iran, but it's certainly the middle of the end.
Okay, do you subscribe to the argument that some people have made to this channel that US intervention is risky because it could actually have the effect of undermining the protest movement and creating a rally around the flag moment? What do you make of that argument?
Oh, I think that's definitely a consideration that they'll have to take into account as they make these decisions. That would be especially true if Israel were involved. with the United States in any type of military intervention. The regime has used this playbook for decades of blaming all of its problems on the United States, Israel. But I think the public is sort of numb to those accusations. They realize that a regime that can't even deliver water and gasoline to its own population is failing on its own account. The corruption, the endemic corruption of this regime that has been in power for most of my lifetime, about 50 years, they just aren't delivering for the public. The rial is plummeting. So it really is starting to look like a failed state.
Right. And can you detect any signs of fractures within the apparatus that runs Iran?
Well, certainly that's what we have to be looking for. But in these situations, at some point, if you're a member of the security forces or law enforcement, you have to think, what's the future? Do you really want to be shooting your own population? I mean, these are your brothers and sisters. So at some point, there may be a fracture in the security services as they start to think about their own personal futures. And maybe if they view the regime as a sinking ship, they will flee it.
And in terms of just going back to the Iranian retaliation and what they might do next, I mean, are there any signs we should be looking out for here in the Middle East in terms of a stepping up of preparedness at US military bases, which are, of course, dotted all over the Gulf? What would you be on the lookout for?
Yeah, in these circumstances, we always enhance the security posture of our bases. We have good cooperation with the host nations that, that provide access for our bases. So I do believe that we're prepared. We are in a defensive posture regarding our troop presence in the region.
Okay, and just to wrap up this conversation, I mean, there are those who are speculating that the regime in Iran faces the real risk of collapse. I wonder if you share that assessment or whether you think it's been perhaps overstated at this stage.
Well, I'm not on the ground in Iran. There has been a blackout, shutting down of the internet, so information is scarce. I don't have any direct information on what's going on inside. But I do think the trend line of this regime is towards trending towards collapse. I do. Whether that will happen this year or in 3 years or 5 years, it's very, very hard to predict. That's an unknown. I mean, we've looked at these situations over history. The Tiananmen Square, where the Chinese Communist Party was able to quell that uprising. But this is a major, major uprising and a threat to the survival of the regime because it's so widespread.
Okay, well, we're going to leave it there. Really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Andrew Weber, former US Assistant Secretary of Defense. Thank you very much indeed for your time, sir.
Thank you.